So to begin, in my study of Galenic pharmacy, in my book Compound Remedies, I argued that the Galenic tradition developed over a series of stages, one of which involved its transport to the Americas under the Spanish Empire. I found that its presence in the pharmacies of the cities of central Mexico, also known as New Spain, conformed closely to the Galenic tradition. These cities were located mainly in the colonial core of the viceroyalty around what is known as the Altiplano region, a temperate area of relatively high altitude due to volcanic activity that includes the all-important Valley of Mexico, where Mexico City is located. And that was also the same valley and the exact same city, basically, that was the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan. And I'll refer to sort of the Aztec tradition and the greater kind of Nahua traditions of materia medica and sort of pharmacy as well as I go through this talk. But what I want to first show you, actually, let me switch slides here. I wanted to just show you a couple of maps of New Spain. This is a map of the Viceroyalty of New Spain in 1819, and I wanted to show you this because you can see that basically what we think of as sort of colonial Mexico is much bigger than what Mexico is today and includes huge parts of what is today the United States, particularly the southwestern United States and California. And then you can see also the parts that were sort of claimed by the United States and various territories and things like that. And also you'll see that, the Viceroyalty also included Caribbean islands and Central America as well. But what I really wanted to point out here is you can see it more clearly in this map, is that the Zoom controls were right in the middle of where I wanted to show you this. Anyway, the part of the map where you see this sort of green area is really kind of that central kind of colonial core that I'll be talking about. And that is really where you see colonial cities established where Galenic medicine, Galenic pharmacy is brought from the Spanish Empire to these cities. So it's really sort of this green area, and really actually even within that green area, it's sort of the kind of the center of that even. That's sort of that colonial core that I'll be talking about. And then you can see that also in this next slide right here, where you can see some of the major cities in that colonial core region as well, that kind of Altiplano region. And then you can see in that sort of larger cutout what that area that I'm talking about. So during the colonial era, the cities of the Altiplano region were inhabited mainly by people of Spanish descent and were thoroughly Hispanized, a characteristic largely due to the fact that Spanish colonial rule was based upon a bifurcated division of colonial society into what they called two republics, a republic of Spaniards and a republic of Indians that were governed and administered according to different laws, different tax codes, and different court systems. The idea was that ideally these two populations would live in separate locations, with people of Spanish descent living in the urban environment of the colonial cities and people of Native American descent living in their in their traditional pueblos in the Mexican countryside. Of course, the population was never divided that neatly, but for the most part, Mexican cities tended to be dominated by a Hispanized population with Hispanized customs and practices, while rural areas were dominated by indigenous communities. This dynamic, I argue, serves to explain why Galenic pharmacy stayed largely intact in New Spain cities, where people of Spanish descent would continue with the medical and pharmaceutical traditions that they were used to, that they and their families and their ancestors were used to. But what about medical practice outside the urban areas of New Spain? How did Galenic pharmacy fare in the largely indigenous rural areas in and beyond Mexico's central Altiplano region? Furthermore, over the course of the 16th and 17th centuries, as the Spanish colonial establishment increasingly spread beyond the colonial core, how did the Galenic tradition interact with the Nahua and other indigenous medical traditions and pharmaceutical practices already in place? For despite the separation dictated by the two republics, increasing numbers of people of Spanish descent ventured further and further into the hinterland of Mexico beyond the colonial core over time, setting up mining establishments, acquiring landed estates, and for religious clergy, founding missions. By the 18th century, for example, Franciscans and Jesuits had founded missions far outside the colonial core of Sonora, Sinaloa, and Baja and Alta California. And you can see that then in these next slides. Here are some of the main mining regions actually in New Spain. And as more and more mines were discovered sort of further north and south and to a certain extent east and west of that colonial core region, you have further and further colonial development and a colonial presence there. And then you can also see this here. This is a map showing Franciscan and Jesuit missions largely of Baja California. And so again, you can see how these missions sort of bring Spanish institutions, colonial institutions, to these hinterlands far from that colonial core region. This paper aims to answer these questions by tracing the development of a new genre of what was called medicina casera, or domestic medicine, or what I have called rustic medicine, that consisted largely of a blending of Galenic and indigenous materia medica and technique. This tradition was embodied in a series of medical texts published in Mexico City between the late 16th and the early 18th centuries, because Mexico City did get its own press as early as basically the 16th century. And then I want to just show you this slide. This is a listing of some of the texts of rustic medicine that I'll be talking about today, or these are the ones I'm going to talk about today. There are a few more that I didn't include for various reasons, but I think these are the most important for, for pharmaceutical purposes, especially the latter two, Farfan and Steinefer's work I'll be talking about quite a bit. Anyway, of great pharmaceutical importance, these texts were written by licensed physicians and pharmacists, as well as Augustinians, Franciscans, and Jesuits with and without formal medical training, but all with one main goal in common: to provide basic medical care and recipes for home remedies for those without access to the urban colonial medical establishment. Such a goal was particularly urgent in the countryside due, according to the authors, to the lack of licensed practitioners, colonial practitioners, outside the colonial cities, and to the widespread epidemic disease that plagued Mexico, especially in the first century of contact and colonization. I argue that these texts were fundamentally of a pharmaceutical nature and derived from centuries of learned expertise, but consistently and specifically sought to provide remedies for those without access to medical experts or pharmacies in the Western Galenic tradition. Each of these works addressed a range of illnesses, from minor afflictions and cosmetic issues to the major epidemic diseases threatening the Novo Hispanic population. In this tradition, rural indigenous materials and practices joined Galenic materials and practices to form this rustic medicine tradition, a tradition that arguably forms the basis for modern curanderismo, or folk healing traditions, in Mexico and the southwestern United States today. These texts have received attention from Mexican and Spanish authors and relatively little from Anglophone scholars, who have mainly pointed out their mestizo, or mixed quality, and that they integrated Galenism with native medical traditions. These texts of rustic medicine, they have argued, were the product of, quote, inverse acculturation that showed the influence of native medicine on those trained in the Galenic tradition, or, quote, the impact that indigenous culture had on classical Spanish medicine in New Spain. One major scholar, Germán Somolinos, went on to argue that, quote, in the works of the 16th and early 17th centuries, we find that included within therapeutic concepts and methods of Galenic origin appear innumerable elements of indigenous use that mark the medicine, above all the therapeutics, with an original and unmistakable stamp. Thus, these authors recognized and celebrated the mixed nature of these texts, but in so doing, have emphasized indigenous elements at the expense of exploring their European Galenic elements and the way it was appropriated into rustic medicine. And there is little in the way of analysis of pharmaceutical materials or practices. That is what I propose to do here, and in so doing, to emphasize the ways in which Galenic pharmacy and medicinal plants from the Galenic tradition were transplanted to Mexico and also played a key role in establishing the basis not only for this tradition of rustic medicine, but also modern curanderismo. The first work of this kind was by Alonso Lopez de Hinojoso in his Summary and Compilation of Surgery, first published in 1578. And so the title of it, notwithstanding, well, and I should also say Lopez de Hinojoso was a barber surgeon, but it also has a very strong pharmaceutical component, as you will see. So Lopez de Hinojoso was a barber surgeon of modest origins who worked in various hospitals, first in his native Spain, and then in the Hospital of Jesus, and then the Royal Indian Hospital of Mexico City, where he worked for more than a decade. His text explained how to treat various ailments and included a book on anatomy, another on phlebotomy, and another on childbirth. At the end, though, was, quote, an antidotary of all the drugs that go in this book. These remedies were, according to Viceroy Don Luis de Velasco, quote, so useful and helpful that many people procured the book and the edition was used up, necessitating a second printing in 1595. A local physician supported the book's republication, arguing that the book was, quote, well written and helpful and useful to simple, rustic folk who did not have ready access to a physician who can cure them. The book would help with the difficulties of childbirth and provide cures, quote, for the illnesses that most commonly befall children in New Spain. In addition, it would be most helpful for, quote, people on ranches, in mines, and in remote areas that lack doctors. Another highly important medical treatise was produced, this time by a man with little or no formal medical training, Gregorio Lopez. A religious hermit for much of his life, Lopez wrote a number of theological treatises, but also received great recognition for his medical work. As a young man in Spain, he spent time and may have received training at the Monastery and Hospital of Guadalupe in Extremadura. And in Mexico, he served for 9 years in the Hospital of Santa Cruz in Huastepec, the former site of Aztec Emperor Montezuma's enormous botanical garden outside Mexico City, or Tenochtitlan, now overseen by religious friars in the 16th century. During the time that he worked at that hospital, Lopez wrote The Treasury of Medicines for All Illnesses, finished around 1589. Although the book was not published until 1674, it circulated widely in manuscript form and was well known throughout the colonial period. And it went on to be published 3 more times in Mexico City once again, and in Madrid in 1708 and in 1727. According to Lopez, his experiences at the Hospital of Santa Cruz propelled him to create the Treasury of Medicines. Quote, given the lack of doctors and medicines throughout all of the Kingdom of New Spain at the time, Lopez wrote his book to, quote, come to the aid of the urgent necessities he experienced there. The work was composed of an alphabetical listing of various diseases and their cures. Although Lopez was not formally trained in medicine, elite physicians advocating the work's publication in 1674 attested to the author's knowledge of medical science and to the overall quality, usefulness, and reliability of its remedies. They also noted its empirical style and its practicality as a medical handbook for the general population, quote, accessible to all. Similarly, Agustin Farfan, an Augustinian friar trained in medicine, wrote the Treatise on Medicines for All Illnesses, not for medical experts, but for the benefit of the general population, especially those living without access to licensed medical care. You can probably see that common theme here. First published in 1579 with an expanded and in some ways altered version appearing in 1592, the treatise on medicines included remedies for a wide range of illnesses. Farfan declared that he wrote not for physicians, but, quote, rather for those who live where there are none. For that reason, he had aimed to write as clearly as possible, quote, so that everyone can understand me. The medicines he described in the book were also specifically geared toward home remedies, using ingredients that would be easily accessible and simple to make. In this way, people everywhere would be able to facilitate their own healing, a theme about which Farfan was passionate and saw as his God-given duty, about which he returned to throughout the book, saying, quote, God willing, everyone, no matter where they are, will be able to make these remedies easily. This was the whole purpose of his book. It was, quote, with this intention that I decided to put here in this book everything that I could to help mainly those that are far away from the largest pueblos that have doctors, because those people suffer illnesses and afflictions, and because they don't know how to cure them, they die every day. In this way, Farfan, like Lopez de Hinojoso, intended his book to be for anyone and everyone outside the major urban areas without access to licensed medical care and well-stocked pharmacies. His remedies would include ingredients that could be found in local orchards, fields, and gardens and be compounded in any kitchen. A century later appeared Juan de Steinefer's Anthology of Medicine of All Illnesses, based upon his work in the Jesuit missions of northwestern Mexico and California. And so here is an image then of this book, this anthology of medicines. And just as a reminder, here's sort of the map of various missions in Baja California. And this is a lot of the region that Steinefer was, as you'll see in a minute, was supposed to travel around, basically. And then here are just some images of some of the, the main sort of churches of these missions that are still standing. I'm actually, though, going to go back to, sorry, I'm having a difficult time with, okay, let me just go back to this, though, as I sort of read through this next bit. Born in Moravia in 1664 and trained as a pharmacist, a fact confirmed by the sophisticated knowledge of contemporary pharmacy that his work demonstrates, Steinefer became a lay Jesuit brother and was sent to Chihuahua to administer cures to brethren as well as indigenous peoples with whom they worked. Steinefer's work was widely popular throughout the 18th century, first published in 1712 and reprinted 5 more times, in Amsterdam in 1719 and in Madrid in 1729 and 1755, among others. The anthology was divided in 3 parts. Part 1 discussed a range of diseases and their cures, Part 2 discussed surgical procedures, and Part 3 included a catalog of basic remedies and medicines named in the text. Steinefer's work was specifically meant to be accessible to the rural population at large living away from colonial medical institutions. Living among his Jesuit brethren in the remote regions of Mexico, he was confronted continuously with the lack of medical professionals to cure the ills of, quote, those who live outside the cities and places of abundance and cultivation. He talked of the Jesuits in the provinces of Sinaloa, Sonora, Chihuahua, and California, so both Baja and Alta California, who worked, quote, without any solace or access whatsoever to physicians nor to pharmacies. Indeed, in his work, he faced continual difficulties, the sheer amount of illness and lack of medical expertise in the area, and the widespread area over which the missions were established, all of which rendered his efforts insufficient. Thus, he decided to write this book, quote, with the intention that it would help to overcome my insufficiency, that it is not humanly possible to be in so many missions so far away from each other at once as would be my true desire. In this way, the book would be able to reach many people, quote, not only the missionary fathers, but also the poor Indians they minister to, who would otherwise be without medical advice or care. With this objective in mind, the anthology privileged discussion of remedies that could be made at home from materials available locally and requiring little more than culinary expertise to prepare. The work was based upon the learned medicine of the, quote, classical authors, but with a caveat, quote, accepting certain medicines native to this land. Thus, Steinafer incorporated local indigenous cures in addition to European ones, and declared that his intention was to, quote, record only the so-called home remedies, since the remedies in the pharmacies are far away and would not be readily available. And to help the poor, there is also included at the end of the book a separate catalog of medicines that explains how to make and compound certain ordinary medicines that best fulfills my desire to serve those who lack physicians and pharmacies. These texts of rustic medicine then all shared the goal of making medical care accessible to people outside the colonial establishment, where Spaniards and indigenous people alike would lack access to a medical practitioner trained and licensed in the Galenic tradition. No doubt there was plenty of access for indigenous communities to traditional local healers, as there would have been since time immemorial. Thus, these texts do not represent any kind of pure or unadulterated Native American tradition. I would argue that they are very much written within sort of a Spanish tradition. And again, you would need to be literate, as I'll talk about in just a minute, in order to access them. So they don't represent any kind of pure or unadulterated Native American tradition or even a Native American perspective. And it is unclear and in fact doubtful that they would have served as important texts for indigenous communities at the time, as these communities, again, would have had their own medical practices and traditions. These texts were written and printed in Spanish, and thus one had to be literate in Spanish and have the means to access them in order for the text to be of use. Nevertheless, I would argue that these texts represented an amalgamation of Spanish and indigenous traditions, not only in terms of the medicinal substances or simples and the compounds, compounds are sort of a mixture of one or more simple that these texts named, but also in the ways that they sought to simplify recipes and propose multiple substitutes if a particular simple were not available. They also may have been accessible to indigenous communities located in and around missions, presidios, ranches, haciendas, and mines, again, outside of that colonial core, especially as the Spanish colonial presence was expanding out from that colonial core region. And ultimately, over the centuries, as documented by anthropologist Margarita Kay, they became the basis for modern practices of curanderismo, or folk healing traditions of Mexico and the US Southwest. I will now turn to the various characteristics of those texts in order to illustrate the basis and contours of the rustic medical tradition that they represent. First, the medicines included in these texts included substances or simples native to Mexico, as well as those that had been transplanted from the Old World Galenic tradition. I'm saying Old World in sort of in quotes. Gregorio Lopez included in his Treasury of Medicines, or Treasure of Medicines, different lists of simples, two different lists of simples, the first of which included 35 indigenous substances and the second one 12. Lopez de Hinojoso's work named 39 indigenous substances, the same number included by Steinafer in indices of medicines found in his work. These indigenous simples included some of the most important substances in the Nahua pharmacopoeia, or the pharmacopoeia of the Aztecs, and in growing colonial commerce. Guayacán, which was used for syphilis, to cure syphilis, sarsaparilla, cochineal, tobacco and cacao, or the chocolate bean, the purgatives, mechoacan and jalap, and foods such as jicama, sapote, and chia. And here I will show you a list. Oh, hold on, let me go back through these. Here's a listing of various indigenous simples that were named in these different indices and catalogs of these texts. Thus, Nahua, Materia Medica, and other local indigenous simples were significant factors in remedy preparation for the rustic medicine tradition. What secondary source coverage does not address adequately, however, is the fact that these simples represent only a fraction, and sometimes only a small fraction, of all the simples in the texts. Let me go to this slide then, which will show you sort of the percentages. In each of these three works, Old World Galenic simples comprise the majority of those named in the catalogs and indices. Lopez de Hinojoso's Antidotary has the highest proportion of indigenous to Old World simples, with 39 indigenous simples out of 119 total identifiable simples, a rate of 33%. Esteinaffer's 39 native simples were out of 135 total, a rate of 29%, or about a third of the total. Gregorio Lopez's first list is notable for the vast amount of traditional Galenic simples included, over 90% of the identifiable list of 465 total simples, of which 35 or 7.5% were indigenous. His second shorter list was less wide-ranging, with 12 indigenous simples out of 60, or 20% indigenous. The works of Farfan and Esteinaffer are especially helpful in illustrating another characteristic of this genre of rustic medicine, given that each author specifically stipulated in his work various alternatives for remedies that could be formulated by those without any access whatsoever to an official colonial pharmacy. Such explicit references then can provide a sense of what kinds of materials would have been accessible to the people who would presumably have been using these books. And these would have been people outside the colonial urban center, but literate in Spanish or having access to someone literate in Spanish, and with access to locally grown New and Old World cultivars. Overall, the focus of both the Treatise of Medicine and the Anthology of Medicine was on naming familiar ingredients and explaining the ways they would be prepared, ingredients that presumably the book's reader would have had on hand in the household or nearby. They also described fairly simple procedures that could be performed in any kitchen using typical utensils. Many of the measurements and size specifications indicated were also accessible and understandable. Though they also used standardized weight and volume measurements, Farfan and Esteinaffer also referred to the quantities of a, quote, handful or compared sizes to known objects, that a simple be ground, for example, quote, to the size of a grain of wheat or to the size of a nut. As we shall see, they included a series of substitutions and alternatives in case a particular simple was not available. The simples named in Farfan and Esteinaffer's recipes for those without access to a pharmacy included a range of mainly plant materials, both indigenous to New Spain and transplanted from Afro-Eurasia. These are the simples then that we can assume the people using the books had regular access to in their daily life. The simples included a large number of transplanted cultivars. As was the case with the indices and catalogs of the different works just discussed a few minutes ago, indigenous substances prescribed for those without pharmacy access in these texts remained a minority, about 21% of the total of 82 different substances named. And here you can see then the indigenous substances then that were named in these works that were specifically for people who didn't have access to official pharmacies in Mexico. So these simples included a predominance of Michoacan powder and the related matlalistic, as well as jalap root, which were substances widely known for their purgative qualities, used throughout central Mexico and exported to Europe as well. These simples were employed as Farfan's purgative of choice for those unable to access pharmacies, especially since, as he noted, quote, Michoacan powder is found everywhere. Other indigenous substances included, among others, maguey honey from the maguey cactus or the agave, sapote, sarsaparilla, incense, and copal resins, among others. Simples of Old World origins made up the remaining 79%, or 65 out of the total of 82, named in these texts, again, for people without access to pharmacies, meaning that these was assumed that all of these materials then would be available nearby. Many of the simples were typical of Galenic pharmacy and typical of plants transplanted to New Spain, including Caña fistula for purging, such herbs and spices, and I won't name all of them, but I'll go through some, as anise, plantain, borage, fennel, parsley, sorrel, maidenhair, mallow, myrtle, chamomile, licorice, dill, saffron, rue, and purslane, such flowers as rose, poppy, and iris, such vegetables, fruits, and legumes as celery, lettuce, pomegranate, grape, asparagus, plum, lemon, melon, quince, orange, watermelon, rhubarb, and garbanzo, or chickpea, and such gum resins as turpentine, storax, and mastic. A variety of old world plant simples then were assumed to be available throughout the Mexican countryside and thus had been transplanted to New Spain, which I have documented in a different study. The books also described how to make homemade compound medicines, mainly syrups, but also a variety of oils, waters, preserves, and ointments. And here I'll show you some of the oils, waters, preserves, and ointments. I didn't include syrups, which were just ubiquitous throughout these texts because there were so many, as you'll see in just a second. Both authors included a variety of compounds for home remedies, but they were generally less complex and and composed of a more homogeneous set of simples than for those with access to pharmacies. The simples used to make the compounds, furthermore, reflect the emphasis on transplanted materials. Following his method of first preparing patients with medicinal syrups before administering a purge, Farfan emphasized the fabrication of homemade syrups and wrote clear and simple instructions so that, quote, you can make all of them in your house without the need of pharmacy or physician. The syrups typically consisted of two or more simples ground into powder and cooked in water, often barley water, until it reduced by 1/3 to 1/2. Then sugar or honey and sometimes vinegar was added until the mixture began to foam, at which point it would have reached the right consistency. And you can also see then that he's also naming various oils, waters, preserves, and ointments. Oh, whoops, sorry. I forgot that is actually the last slide. Another aspect of rustic medicine apparent in the texts of Farfan and Esteinaffer is the role of substitutions of ingredients in the pharmaceutical recipes. Each author provided multiple examples of substitutions in their recipes, and every effort was made to provide as many alternatives as possible. Farfan often listed many different possible medicinal cures for one illness. Substitutions appear to have been an accepted and natural part of the home remedies in which the priority was to use ingredients that would be on hand. Esteinaffer expressed this sentiment in the prologue to his readers, saying, quote, included here as well are many and varied specific medicines in addition to general medicines, so that if one thing is not on hand, as happens in many parts of these provinces, there be another among them. In this way, preparers of medicines were often given a choice of various possibilities of simples to include. Additionally, a recipe calling for many different ingredients could still be effective if one or more of the ingredients could not be located. For a bloody nose, for example, Farfan specified a cure containing a mixture of plantain root and rose cooked in sorrel or mastic water, then adding juice of purslane, quince, and pomegranate, and then sugar. At the end of the recipe, however, he noted that, quote, if of the things I say here to make this syrup are missing, add the same quantity of the other things you have. Esteinaffer proposed another way to deal with this situation in that, quote, where in one medication are put various herbs or ingredients, if one or another is missing, you can duplicate them. You can duplicate or take 2 or 3 times as much of what is there. For Esteinaffer, this practice was safe except in the case of purgatives, in which one had to take great care as some were known to be stronger than others, so that such supplementation could be dangerous. Farfan appears to have followed this logic as well, naming substitutes for various purgatives, but specifying the amount to use based upon its relative strength. Common to Farfan's discussion of purgatives was the substitution of cana fistula, the purgative of choice, but that could be substituted with the native Michoacan powder or jalap root or matlali steak. To purge a weak stomach, for example, he recommended Caña fistula, but, quote, if you only have Michoacan root, use that in barley water strained and pressed, adding sugar. For bloody nose, he recommended jalap root and plantain water, but said that, quote, those who have only Michoacan powder could use that instead. If that were not available, the preparer should locate, quote, pine nuts that are commonly available, then take a chicken, and when it is half cooked, add to the pot 12 nuts that are peeled and ground. Perhaps the most liberal directive was in the cure for obstruction or hardening of the liver. Quote, if you don't have Michoacan powder, he said, add any other root whatsoever that purges. Thus, Farfan appears to view these purgatives as interchangeable, though with varying degrees of intensity. In conclusion, the rustic medicine as described here in these texts, particularly in the work of Farfan and Steinafer, demonstrated sophistication and considerable expertise while also being highly versatile and clear, with step-by-step instructions for the preparation of medicines that, for the most part, could be found locally and also administered with typical local beverages, broths, and porridge. When ingredients were not at hand, the authors included a host of possible alternatives and substitutions. They also combined a mix of Old World and New World materials, and largely for that reason have been labeled, as we saw above, examples of the cultural mestizaje of medicine in early colonial Mexico that went on to provide the basis for modern curanderismo. In fact, in the 1970s, anthropologist Margarita Kay found folk healers in the southwestern United States, and mainly in sort of New Mexico and Arizona and those states, using Steinafer's texts as the basis for their diagnosis and treatment. This is in the 1970s. She recounts that she had long suspected a common textual basis for widespread disease concepts and healing practices, particularly the shared vocabulary of disease and of certain prominent herbs in use across the greater southwest of the US and in northwestern Mexico. That text, she argues, was Steinafer's. Whether this was indeed the case or not, the herbs she names, rue, wormwood, rosemary, elder blossom, mallow, sage, garlic, and mint, would all have been transplanted to Mexico from Afro-Eurasia and were all part of the Mediterranean Galenic pharmacopoeia. Anthropologist George Foster has also noted widespread use of similar Old World simples in modern-day curanderismo in Mexico and the United States, including garlic, balm, aloe, rue, rosemary, oregano, pennyroyal, marjoram, mallow, dill, lavender, artemisia, plantain, sorrel, and verbena. Further studies of folk healing and curanderismo from Mexico and Mexican communities in the U.S. show similar reliance on transplanted medicines, as well as continued use of important materials from the Nahua pharmacopoeia and other indigenous traditions. Although I would not go so far as to say that these rustic medicine texts form the basis for these modern traditions, there is a clear and strong continuity in the materia medica they used, not only in its hybrid nature, but the ways in which transplanted medicines have become appropriated and naturalized into healing practices now considered traditional and in some ways quintessentially Mexican. But I would also argue that this was not an imposition, but a choice among these Native communities. Thank you.